Now, it's only fair that I give you a warning. This podcast covers true crimes. It includes serial killers, mass murderers, rapists, child molesters, cults, war criminals, and more. It is not for the faint of heart, and listener discretion is advised. You have been warned. I'm DM Green, and this is In the Dark Mind. Samuel Little spent most of his life moving through American cities without leaving much of a trace. He worked odd jobs, drifted from state to state, and spent time in and out of jail for theft, assault, and drug offenses. He blended into a landscape of bus stations, flop houses, back roads, and cheap motels. On paper, he looked like a petty criminal with a long but unremarkable record. In reality, he was something else entirely. The man later identified as the most prolific serial killer in United States history, with nearly 100 claimed victims and at least dozens confirmed. Born in the 1940s and active from the early 1970s through the mid-2000s, Little hunted in plain view of police agencies that never quite connected his trail of violence. He targeted women who lived on the margins of society, sex workers, women who struggled with addiction, women who had already slipped out of touch with family and community. Many of his victims were black. Many had prior contacts with law enforcement, unstable housing, or no fixed address at all. That combination made them easier to approach and, crucially, easier to erase from the systems that might otherwise have protected them or sounded an alarm when they disappeared. Little's methods were simple and devastatingly effective. He preferred manual strangulation. He knew how to inflict lethal violence without leaving obvious marks that would always be recognized as homicide, especially in eras and jurisdictions where coroners were overworked and toxicology screens were inconsistent. Victims found outdoors or in abandoned locations could be written off as overdoses, exposure, or accidents. Bodies found indoors did not always receive the level of scrutiny that might have revealed a killer's hands at work. This gap between what he was doing and what authorities were prepared to see allowed him to keep moving and keep killing for decades. For a long time, Little existed in a gap between jurisdictions and categories. He was known to police, but not feared. He was arrested, but rarely for the worst of what he had done. When he left one city, there was no central narrative that followed him, no composite picture tying together the unidentified women who had died after crossing his path. A murder here, an unexplained death there, an unsolved case file in a drawer. These remained isolated events, scattered across the map, each one tragic, but on its own, not enough to explain the scale of what was happening. That scale did not fully emerge until the 2010s, when a relatively routine arrest on a narcotics charge in Kentucky led to a DNA match in California, and from there to a cascade of confessions. By then, Samuel Little was an older man in a wheelchair, held in a California prison. Over months of interviews, he calmly described killing women from coast to coast, city after city, year after year. He drew their faces from memory, carefully shading cheekbones and hairlines, recalling details of clothing, jewelry, and landscapes long since altered or erased. Law enforcement agencies across the country began matching his recollections to their cold cases. A pattern that had always been present but never fully seen finally came into focus. The story of Samuel Little is not only a story about a prolific murderer, it is also a story about whose lives are treated as disposable, whose disappearances are noticed, and how long a determined offender can operate when he chooses victims who are already fighting for space in the official record. It is a story of delayed recognition, of investigators trying to reconstruct crimes stretching back half a century, and the families who waited years, sometimes decades, for a name to be attached to a loss they never fully understood. This episode traces that story from its beginnings to its unfinished ends. Little's early years and the development of his offending, the long arc of his crimes, the investigation that finally held him in place, and the continuing work to identify the women who never made it home. Samuel Little entered the world as Samuel McDowell on June the 7th, 1940, in the small town of Reynolds, Georgia. His mother, Bessie May, was a teenager when she had him. Census records list her as a maid and name his father as a 19-year-old man named Paul McDowell, but the family that raised him did not revolve around a stable set of parents. Little later described his mother as a sex worker who abandoned him as an infant. Whatever the exact details, he grew up without the steady presence of both parents in the home. Soon after his birth, the family left rural Georgia and moved to Lorain, Ohio, a steel manufacturing town on the shore of Lake Erie. The move mirrored a broader migration of black families leaving the Jim Crow South for industrial jobs in the Midwest. In Lorain, Little was raised primarily by his grandmother. The city's mills, rail yards, and lakefront docks formed a backdrop to his childhood. But inside the small household that sheltered him, there was no conventional family structure, no stable father figure, and only a sporadic connection to his mother. Little attended Hawthorne Junior High School in Lorain. Teachers and classmates have not left detailed public records of his performance or personality, but the broad outline is clear. He did not thrive in the classroom. Later accounts would describe him as having a troubled time in school and eventually dropping out. Formal education ended early, and with it, any steady path into legitimate work or further training. He drifted towards the streets, where boredom, anger, and curiosity met a world that offered easy opportunities for petty crime. By his own description, something darker had begun much earlier, long before the first arrest. Little said that as a child, he developed a fixation on women's necks and on the act of strangulation. He traced it back to a memory from kindergarten, watching his teacher touch her own neck, feeling a surge of fascination he could not explain. As he grew older, that fascination sharpened into sexual fantasy. In adolescence, he began collecting true crime magazines that focused on women being choked or strangled and poring over the images and stories. This was not a passing curiosity. It became a private, enduring theme in his imagination, linking violence and arousal in a way that never loosened its grip. Crime entered his life early. In 1956, while still a teenager, Little was convicted of breaking and entering in Omaha, Nebraska. He was sent to juvenile institution, his mother listed in the paperwork as whereabouts unknown. That phrase captured more than a bureaucratic problem. The boy had effectively grown up as a child passed along without a stable parent to advocate for him or impose limits on him. Behind bars for the first time, he encountered a world where physical dominance carried weight and where his emerging fantasies about control and strangulation fitted neatly into a culture that respected toughness and fearlessness. After his release, Little returned to Ohio, but any chance of a quiet, law-abiding life was already slipping away. In 1961, at 21, he broke into a furniture store in Lorain. The conviction earned him a 3-year sentence at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, an institution that would later be closed amid criticism of its harsh conditions. Other accounts also tie him to a break-in at a Lorain dry cleaning business in the same period. One more entry on a growing list of property crimes. Prison did not interrupt his pattern so much as deepen it. He began to see incarceration as a recurring part of his life, rather than an exceptional experience. Inside, he took up boxing. He later referred to himself as a former prizefighter, proud of the reputation he built in prison rings. Training and fighting honed his sense of his own physical strength and taught him how to control another person's body at close range. The techniques of grappling, of using his hands and upper body to dominate an opponent, became second nature. Outside the ring, that capacity for focused, sustained physical control sat alongside the fantasies about strangling women that had followed him from childhood. When his prison term ended in the mid-1960s, Little did not return to anything resembling stability. By the late 1960s, he had moved to Florida, where he re-established contact with his mother and stayed with her for a time. He worked short-term jobs, including stints as a cemetery worker and ambulance attendant. Burial grounds and emergency calls, bodies lowered into graves and loaded into vehicles, became part of his working landscape. There is no evidence that these jobs directly triggered his violence, but they keep him close to death, the quiet edges of public life where few questions were asked. From this point onward, motion defined him. Little began traveling widely across the United States. He rarely stayed in one city for long. He lived in cheap motels, rooming houses, and on the street. He hitched rides, drove old cars, and moved through bus stations and truck stops. Between the early 1960s and mid-1970s, law enforcement agencies across at least 11 states arrested him repeatedly. By 1975, he had been arrested 26 times. The charges ranged across a broad spectrum: theft, shoplifting, fraud, driving under the influence, solicitation, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and sexual offenses, including attempted rape. These were not isolated mistakes or a short burst of delinquency. This was now a way of life. In many of these encounters, Little's victims were women living on the margins, sex workers, women struggling with addiction, and women without stable housing. They were the people he approached on dark streets, in bars, or in neighborhoods where the police were already overloaded with calls. Violence appeared again and again in the reports: fights, beatings, attacks that stopped short of murder but showed what he was willing to do with his hands. Each arrest ended with a release, a plea, or a short sentence. No single jurisdiction held him long enough to recognize how frequently he was turning up elsewhere. The constant movement gave him a certain kind of freedom. He learned which neighborhoods in which cities offered anonymity. He became comfortable in red light districts, near truck routes, under highway overpass, and in the clusters of bars and clubs where people came and went at all hours. He knew how to talk to women who were used to being approached by strangers, how to offer a ride, a drink or drugs, and how to present himself as a harmless older man with a soft voice and a ready smile. On the surface, he drifted. Underneath, his preferences and fantasies were set. By the beginning of the 1970s, Samuel Little was in his early 30s. He had no formal education, no diploma, no stable work history, and no fixed address. He had a long trail of arrests for theft, fraud, assaults, and sexual violence. He had decades of sexual fixation on strangulation, years of training in how to control another person's body, and a lifestyle that placed him in regular contact with vulnerable women who lived at the edges of official concern. The man who emerged from that background was not yet publicly known as a serial murderer. On paper, he was a career criminal and drifter whose life had been shaped by poverty, instability, and crime. In reality, the stage was already fully set. The escalation from assaults and attempted rapes to a long series of homicides did not come out of nowhere. It grew from habits, desires, and choices that had been solidifying since childhood. When women began to disappear around him in the early 1970s, the pattern he had spent years building moved into a new and far more lethal phase. Samuel Little's admitted killing career stretches from 1970 to 2005. He told investigators he strangled 93 people, almost all of them women. Federal analysts reviewing his statements have confirmed his involvement in at least 60 homicides, the highest number ever conclusively tied to one offender in the United States. He moved constantly, living out of cars, cheap rooms, and shelters. He focused his attention on women already living close to crisis: sex workers, women using cocaine or heroin, women without secure housing or consistent contact with family. Many were black. Some were never reported missing. Their bodies were found in alleys, fields, ditches, and vacant houses, or never found at all. Little's method remained remarkably consistent. He preferred to attack at close range, using his fists and arms. A former boxer, he often stunned or knocked his victims unconscious with punches, then tightened his hands around their necks until their breathing stopped. There were no bullet wounds, no knives, no obvious weapon to recover. Medical examiners faced with decomposed bodies or women known to use drugs and alcohol did not always read the signs of strangulation. Many deaths were ruled overdoses, accidents, or undetermined, and the violence at the center of them passed without formal recognition. Sex and killing were tightly coupled in his pattern. In Los Angeles, police came to know him as the choke and stroke killer, a nickname that reflected reports that he masturbated while strangling his victims and derived direct sexual gratification from the act of cutting off their air supply. In some attacks, he forced or negotiated sex before the assault. In others, the sexual element came solely from his own arousal at the physical domination involved in strangling a struggling or already unconscious woman. His first known homicide lies at the beginning of the 1970s, just outside of Miami. The woman's name was Mary Brosley, a 33-year-old from Massachusetts who had drifted south, leaving behind 2 children and a tangle of broken relationships. She walked with a slight limp and wore a metal necklace. One night she met Little at a bar in North Miami Beach. They drank, talked, and left together in his car. He drove her out of the busy streets and into a more isolated area outside of the city, away from the neon and the traffic. There, he attacked her, using his hands to choke off her breathing until she stopped moving. He left her in a shallow grave, partially covered, her legs still protruding from the sandy soil. Weeks later, a hunter and his teenage son came across her decomposing body. She had no identification. The medical examiner misjudged her age by decades and, with little visible trauma remaining, did not initially declare the death a homicide. For years she remained a Jane Doe, a suspicious case in a file marked undetermined, while the man who killed her moved on. Around the same period, Little described another killing in South Florida, a young white woman named Angela Chapman, a sex worker with developmental disabilities. He picked her up in Miami, had sex with her, and then drove west towards the Everglades, to an area where few people would be passing at night. At the water's edge, he tried to drown her, forcing her under the water until she lost consciousness. When she lay still, he dragged her back to the shore, waited for her to come to, then wrapped his hands around her neck and strangled her. Her body was left in the marshy landscape outside the city. Another woman whose life ended far from witnesses and streetlights. In Knoxville, Tennessee, a 34-year-old woman named Martha Cunningham left home on the last night of 1974, heading to a New Year's Eve church service. She did not arrive. Days later, searchers found her body in a wooded area on the eastern edge of the county. She lay partially clothed, her dress and slip were pushed up, her underwear and stockings pulled down towards her thighs. Her purse and jewelry were missing, and bruises marked her body. The autopsy could not pinpoint a clear anatomical cause of death, and local officials, noting her history of seizures, called it natural. Decades later, Little told investigators how he had killed a Knoxville woman he knew as Martha. He placed her in the woods not far from where Cunningham had been found, describing her age, race, and circumstances in ways that lined up with the long-closed file. His account added the missing piece to the physical evidence. He strangled her, then left her in the brush, with her clothing displaced and her belongings taken. In 1978 in Mississippi, he would meet another woman who would not survive the encounter. Her name was Julia Critchfield, a 36-year-old mother described by friends as private and self-contained. At some point she crossed paths with Little in the Gulfport area. He later said he strangled her and pushed her from a height into a dirt pitch near Saucier, north of the city. A man walking by discovered her body at the bottom of the pit, nude with a black dress draped over her. The autopsy concluded that she had been killed by manual strangulation. There was no immediate suspect. Her death joined a long list of unsolved homicides involving women who used alcohol or drugs, or who lived on the outskirts of stable community life. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Little's roots traced a loose loop through the South and Midwest. In Macon, Georgia, he admitted to strangling a young woman in 1977 and leaving her body unidentified in the area. In Pascagoula, Mississippi, he spent time among local sex workers. When 22-year-old Melinda Lepre went missing in 1982, suspicion fell on him, but a grand jury declined to indict. That same year in Florida, he spent an evening with 26-year-old Patricia Mount. before her body was found in a field. Witnesses placed him with her in a bar the night before she disappeared, but the case against him collapsed at trial. These episodes share familiar elements. He approached women whose lives were already unstable, women who had few advocates in the systems meant to protect them, and he left behind bodies in outdoor locations where exposure, decomposition, and assumptions about drug or alcohol would obscure the violence of their deaths. San Diego in 1984 shows his method in rare detail, because 2 women survived long enough for the police to intervene. One of them was 22-year-old Lori Barros. She was walking alone at night in late September when a car pulled alongside her. The driver was Little. He grabbed her and forced her into the vehicle. He drove to an isolated field at the edge of the city, away from traffic and houses. There, he beat her, choking her repeatedly until she hovered on the edge of consciousness. He sexually assaulted her and then strangled her until she went limp. Believing she was dead, he dumped her by the roadside and drove away. Barros survived by going completely still, feigning death, and later managed to get help. A month later, police officers patrolling the same area found Little in the back seat of his car with another woman. This one, unconscious, badly beaten, and half strangled. She too would live. The pattern was stark: a vulnerable woman alone at night, an offer or a sudden grab, a drive to an empty field, punches to the head and face, hands closing around the throat, and then abandonment once he believed the victim would not rise again. Little served just over 2 years in prison for the San Diego attacks. When he was released in early 1987, he headed to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, the city's sprawling grid of motels, alleys, and industrial backstreets offered what he wanted: anonymity and ready access to women supporting crack cocaine habits through sex work. In July 1987, 41-year-old Carol Linda Alford disappeared. She was a mother, and like many in her neighborhood, she used cocaine. Little encountered her on the streets of South Los Angeles. The approach would have been familiar: a car slowing down, a short negotiation, the promise of drugs or money in exchange for sex, and then the car door closing. At some point after she got in, he struck her and then strangled her. On July the 13th, her body was found in an alley, naked from the waist down. An autopsy documented blunt force trauma to her head and concluded that she had been strangled. 2 years later, on August 14, 1989, 35-year-old Audrey Nelson Everett vanished. She had children and was known to frequent an area of downtown where bars, small clubs, and sex work overlapped. Little picked her up near East 17th Street, drove her away from the busiest corners, and attacked her. As with Alford, he used his fists, beating her about the head, and then crushed her airway with his hands. After she stopped breathing, he transported her body and dumped it in a trash bin behind a restaurant and nightclub. Workers later found her there, her lower body unclothed, dirt and drag marks visible on her skin. On September 3, 1989, 46-year-old Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca was killed in a similar fashion. She too lived with addiction and moved through the neighborhoods where Little hunted. Once again, he approached in a car. Once again, he offered what she needed: cash, drugs, or both. Inside the vehicle, his demeanor shifted from accommodating to violent. He beat her and then strangled her, then left her body in a garage or abandoned structure in South Los Angeles. When she was found, the circumstances echoed the earlier cases: a woman with a history of drug use, strangled, and discarded in marginal space. Across these Los Angeles murders, the same pattern repeats. The women were meeting dates or seeking drugs in areas where violence was common. They got into his car voluntarily. He attacked them in confined spaces where their screams would not carry. He derived sexual satisfaction from the act of strangling, sometimes masturbating as he held them down, and he left their bodies half-clothed in alleys, dumpsters, and vacant structures. In Odessa, Texas, in the mid-1990s, Little's violence touched another woman whose case would later become central to understanding the full span of his crimes. 32-year-old Denise Christie Brothers was a mother of two, struggling with addiction, who frequented a downtown strip of bars and clubs. She was reported missing on January 1st, 1994, after failing to come home. At some point that night, or in the days that followed, she encountered Little. He took her into his car, drove her to a vacant lot on the edge of town, and strangled her. On February 2nd, a passerby found her body in that lot. There were no immediate suspects, and her case stayed open for years before his later confession and corroborating evidence tied him directly to her death. His killings did not stop in the 1990s. Little described strangling a woman in Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 1994 and leaving her naked in a vacant house, where she was found with a crack pipe under her thigh. Her death was initially classified as cocaine overdose. In Ohio, he met women in bars in Cleveland and on the streets of Cincinnati and Akron. In Cleveland, he picked up 21-year-old Mary Jo Payton at a bar near East 105th Street and Euclid Avenue, took her to an abandoned factory, choked her in his car, and then threw her body down a basement staircase. Workers discovered her weeks later. He laid across paths with 32-year-old Rose Evans, offered her a ride as she walked, drove to an isolated area, and strangled her in his car before dumping her in a vacant lot where she was found on or around August 24th, 1991. The timeline runs forward into the new century. In Tupelo, Mississippi, he killed 46-year-old Nancy Carroll Stevens in 2005, meeting her while she was away from her home in Alabama. He strangled her and left her body in Lee County. In South Carolina, he admitted killing 19-year-old Evelyn Weston in 1978, a case originally treated as a shooting, but now linked to his broader pattern of targeting young women near Fort Jackson. In Kentucky, he described strangling 23-year-old Linda Sue Broads in 1981 and leaving her body on a farm near US Route 68, where it was discovered on May the 15th of that year. Taken together, these scenes show the continuity of his behavior. The locations change from Miami bars to Tennessee woods, from Mississippi dirt pits to Los Angeles alleys and Texas vacant lots. But the essential structure of the crimes does not. He sought out women who were isolated and economically desperate. He relied on the privacy of a car, the vulnerability created by drugs or alcohol, and the element of surprise in his punches. He strangled with his hands and left bodies in places where their deaths would blend into the background of neglect and assumption. Over 3.5 decades, that pattern repeated again and again, leaving behind a trail of women whose lives ended in silence, long before their names were finally spoken in connection with Samuel Little. For most of Samuel Little's active years, there was no single investigation running in the background, with his name at the center. Detectives in different states worked single homicides or clusters of deaths that looked similar, then moved on when the leads dried up. A woman strangled and left in a dirt pit in Mississippi, a body found in a field in Florida, a partially clothed woman on the edge of town in Tennessee. Each case had its own life, its own local context, its own overworked investigators. The women he killed were often written off as victims of the chaos around them: drugs, abusive partners, anonymous Johns who vanished into the night. The link between those files remained invisible for decades. There were moments when the system came close to stopping him. In 1982, Gulf Coast detectives in Pascagoula, Mississippi, arrested Little for the disappearance of 22-year-old sex worker Melinda Lepre. Witnesses placed him with her before she vanished, and her body later turned up in a cemetery. Local authorities were convinced enough to take the case forward, but a grand jury declined to indict. While officers in Pascagoula still viewed him as their strongest suspect, Little was already being pulled into another case. He was extradited to Florida to stand trial for the murder of 26-year-old Patricia Mount, whose body had been found in a rural area in September that same year. Witnesses who had seen him with Mount the night before she disappeared pointed to him again in a Florida courtroom. Jurors did not trust those identifications, and in January 1984, he was acquitted and released. The suspicion stayed in the files. Little did not. Later that year in San Diego, the pattern came into sharper focus, but still without the full picture. Let's head back to earlier, where we spoke of Laurie Barrios, whom Little had badly beaten and strangled, but unwittingly left alive in a field after he grabbed her off the street and assaulted her in his car. And also a month later, when the officers had discovered Little in the backseat of his vehicle with another unconscious woman, also battered and nearly strangled in the same area. For this he was arrested and eventually convicted of assault and false imprisonment. He served the 2.5 years in prison before his release in '87. Inside those case files, San Diego detectives documented a dangerous man who targeted vulnerable women and tried to kill them by strangulation. What they did not know was that he had already killed and that he would continue once he had left their jurisdiction. When Little left prison and drifted to Los Angeles, he entered a city already struggling with violence tied to crack cocaine, sex work, and poverty. In July of 1987, Carol Linda Alford was found strangled in an alley in South Los Angeles, partially unclothed, with signs of blunt force trauma. 2 years later, in August 1989, workers discovered the body of Audrey Nelson in a dumpster behind a restaurant and a nightclub downtown. She too had been beaten and strangled. Weeks after that, in September 1989, 11-year-old boys playing soccer peered through the windows of an abandoned auto repair shop and saw the body of Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, nude from the waist down and dead on the floor. All three women had histories that placed them on the margins: addiction, sex work, or unstable housing. All three had been manually strangled. The detectives who worked those Los Angeles cases saw similarities in the victims and the manner of death. They collected physical evidence, including biological material on clothing, and sent it to crime labs for testing. At that time, DNA technology and national databases were relatively new. Profiles could be built, but the utility depended on having someone to match them to. There was no hit, no name to attach to the genetic signatures pulled from those scenes. The files slowly cooled. The women's family were left with unanswered questions, and their cases moved from active rotation to shelves marked as unsolved. Years passed by. Inside the Los Angeles Police Department, a cold case homicide unit within the Robbery Homicide Division began revisiting older murders with preserved evidence. Detectives like Mitzi Roberts and Rick Jackson took on the Alford, Nelson, and Apodaca files. They had the benefit of improved DNA testing and the National CODIS database, which could now compare profiles from unsolved crimes against samples from offenders across the country. When they pulled the Los Angeles strangulation case and ran the evidence again, they saw something clear. The same unknown male profile appeared across multiple victims. The genetic profile still had no name attached to it. Roberts dug into the backgrounds of the victims and the geography of the crime scenes. The picture that emerged was of a man who moved easily through South Los Angeles, targeted women involved in sex work and drug use, and vanished after the killings. The detectives widened their view, searching for a suspect whose life intersected with that world and whose history matched the violence written into the injuries. That search pulled back a criminal history that did not look like a typical one-time killer. Samuel Little's name surfaced with a rap sheet that spanned decades, multiple states, and included assaults, attempted rape, and the San Diego strangulation cases. One phrase from the detectives summed up how his life looked from their vantage point: theft by day and murder by night. A key problem remained. Little was not in custody in California, and there was no active warrant tying him to the murders themselves. What the Los Angeles team did have was an outstanding narcotics warrant from several years earlier, a relatively minor case that had never been cleared. That warrant became their lever. They traced his social security benefits, which were being deposited onto a prepaid Walmart card, and followed the digital trail to transactions in Louisville, Kentucky. With that information in hand, they brought in the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force. On September 5th, 2012, marshals and local officers found Samuel Little at a Wayside Christian Mission, a homeless shelter in downtown Louisville. He was arrested there on the narcotics warrant and extradited back to California. Back in Los Angeles, standard booking procedures finally connected the man to the old murders. Technicians took a fresh DNA sample from Little and ran it through CODIS. This time, the unknown profile from the clothing of Alford, Nelson, and Apodaca did not come back empty. It matched the man in the holding cell. The cold case detectives now had more than a theory. They had a suspect whose genetic fingerprint was present on the bodies and clothing of 3 women killed between 1987 and 1989. Prosecutors filed charges in early January 2013, accusing him of 3 counts of murder. As news of the arrest went out, detectives in other states opened their own files and began asking whether the drifter, now sitting in a Los Angeles jail, might explain some of the women whose deaths had never been solved. The Los Angeles team dug into his past while they prepared their case. They mapped his prior arrests across the country and built a timeline of where he had lived and when. Patterns jumped out: Pascagoula and the Lepre case, Florida and the Mount trial, San Diego and the 2 surviving victims from 1984, Cleveland, Cincinnati, the Gulf Coast, and the scattered deaths of women who had been strangled and dumped far from witnesses. As they traced his movements through the motel receipts, arrest reports, and old address billings, the 3 Los Angeles murders began to look less like isolated events and more like a portion of a larger hidden series. Publicly though, the case remained focused on the 3 victims for whom they had the strongest forensic evidence. Little went on trial in Los Angeles in 2014. The details of that courtroom battle belong to the next chapter of his story, but its outcome changed the scope of the investigation. He was convicted and sentenced to life in a California prison, effectively removing him from the outside world. At that point, he still denied involvement in any killings beyond those he was forced to confront. And even then, he pushed back against the idea that he was a serial murderer. From his perspective, the violent acts scattered throughout his life were part of a private logic he did not feel compelled to explain. From law enforcement's perspective, a convicted killer with a demonstrated pattern and long history of proximity to suspicious deaths was now held in a secure environment where he could be questioned about other cases. The next major shift came not in California, but in Texas. In 2018, investigators in Odessa revisited the unsolved 1994 strangulation of Denise Christie brothers. Advances in forensic methods and a growing awareness of Little's history prompted a fresh look at the file. A grand jury indicted him for brothers' murder, and he was transferred from California to Ector County Jail to face the charge. There, a Texas Ranger took primary responsibility for interviewing him. Holland approached Little differently than many past interrogators. Instead of a short, confrontational session, he spent hour after hour in the interview room, talking about boxing, women, and memories of life on the road, slowly building a rapport with the aging prisoner. Over time, Little began to talk about more than Denise's brothers. Once he started, he did not stop at one extra case or 2. He described a life of killing that stretched back to 1970 and ran through to 2005. He named cities and rough time frames. He recalled how old a particular woman was, what she had been wearing, where he had parked the car, whether there was a bridge nearby or a billboard visible from the dumping site. He spoke about bodies left in canals, down embankments, in wooded lots, and behind businesses. He claimed 90 murders in all. Texas authorities alerted the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as ViCAP, which specializes in linking violent crimes across jurisdictions. FBI crime analysts and Justice Department specialists joined the effort, sitting in on interviews, drawing up charts, and comparing his accounts with open and closed cases around the country. The work that followed was methodical. Investigators took Little's description and checked them against missing persons reports, autopsy findings, and case files. When he said he had killed a woman behind a bar in one city in a particular year, they pulled every unsolved killing of a woman in that area within the time window and looked for matches in age, race, and cause of death, as well as location. His recall proved startlingly specific. He remembered the color of a victim's car decades later, the layout of an intersection, or the way a road curved as he drove away from a dumping site. In case after case, his details lined up with long unsolved deaths. By November of 2018, investigators had matched at least 34 of his confessions to known homicides. By late 2019, FBI analysts confirmed his involvement in at least 50 killings and publicly named him as the most prolific serial killer in United States history. From his prison cell, Little sketched the faces of women he said he had killed. working with coloured pencils and cheap paper. The drawings, often captioned with the city and approximate year, showed women with distinct hairstyles, jewellery and expressions. The FBI published many of these portraits along with an interactive map of his confessions, asking families and local police to study them for possible matches. In some cases, relatives recognized the faces of women who had disappeared decades earlier. In others, detectives used the sketches and his geographic clues to guide exhumations or reclassification of deaths once written off as accidents or overdoses. By that time, Samuel Little's health had deteriorated and he was spending his final years in a prison infirmary. The investigation built around him had become a national, multi-agency effort. Los Angeles detectives continued to check his accounts against unsolved cases in California. Texas Rangers and local sheriffs from multiple states came to interview him, sometimes leaving with long-sought answers, sometimes with only partial leads. Analysts at ViCAP tracked each new confession, updating internal lists and public releases as more victims were identified and more cases were closed. When he died in December 2020, law enforcement had confirmed his involvement in at least 60 murders, with dozens more still considered highly likely. The arrest at Louisville homeless shelter in 2012 had begun as a routine pickup on an old drug charge. The investigation that grew out of it exposed an extraordinary span of violence. It drew on preserved DNA from alleyways in Los Angeles, on forgotten case files in small southern towns, on the persistence of cold case detectives, and on the patience of a Texas Ranger willing to spend hundreds of hours listening to a frail man in a wheelchair describe one by one the women that he had taken. By the end, the investigation into Samuel Little had evolved into something more than the pursuit of a single offender. It became a belated accounting for those women's lives and a map of how thoroughly one man had learned to move in the blind spots of American law enforcement. In Los Angeles, the case against Samuel Little moved from the cold cases squad's cramped offices into the formal language of the courts in early 2013. Once the DNA profile from the bodies of Carol Linda Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca matched the sample taken from Little after his 2012 arrest, prosecutors filed 3 counts of murder. He was no longer just a drifter with a long record and an old narcotics warrant. On paper, he became what detectives already believed him to be, the man responsible for 3 unsolved strangulations in South Los Angeles in the late 1980s. The pretrial process stretched out over months. Little, now in his 70s, appeared in court in a wheelchair, wearing his jail clothes with his hands shackled. His age and frail presentation clashed with the brutality described in the charging documents. Prosecutors laid out a narrative anchored in physical evidence, a single genetic profile linking his body to the women who had been beaten and strangled, their remains dumped in alleys and abandoned buildings near downtown. The defense team tried to chip away at that foundation. Like many defendants in cases built on DNA and prior sexual contact, Little leaned on the idea that he had engaged in consensual encounters with women who used drugs and sold sex, and that the genetic traces left behind did not prove murder. The issues for the jurors was not whether he had been intimate with the victims, it was what had happened afterwards in the confined space of his car or a small room. Prosecutors anticipated that argument and framed their case accordingly. They did not present the Los Angeles murders as isolated crimes. Instead, they walked jurors through Little's history of violence against women, including the San Diego attacks in 1984, where 2 victims survived strangulation attempts long enough to describe him, and the way he fought. Women from Pascagoula and other cities testified about encounters in which they had also ended up in his car, beaten and nearly choked to death, only to escape by luck, resistance, or the arrival of a passerby. Their stories echoed the Los Angeles evidence. A man who approached them on the street, promised them money or drugs, and then drove them to a secluded place, and then used his hands around their throats. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office relied heavily on the forensic science that had not existed when the murders took place. Analysts explained to the jury how DNA profiles are built, and how the chance of a profile from the victim's clothing belonging to anyone other than Samuel Little was vanishingly small. Jurors heard about the bruises on the women's necks, the internal damage that had pointed to manual strangulation, and the way their bodies had been left, partially undressed, discarded in marginal spaces, where they were likely to be found by strangers rather than by anyone who knew them. The defense offered an alternative frame. They tried to emphasize the victims' drug use and precarious lives, suggesting other possible assailants in violent neighborhoods and other explanations for deaths in a city thick with crime. They pressed witnesses on their memories, especially those from decades earlier. They highlighted the lack of eyewitnesses to the killings themselves. Little maintained his innocence, denying that he had murdered the women and insisting that law enforcement had built a distorted picture around a few pieces of biological evidence. The trial opened in September 2014. Over several weeks, jurors listened to forensic testimony, survivor accounts, and the cold descriptions of crime scenes that had once been active alleys and trash-strewn lots. Photos showed where bodies had been found: Alford in a South Los Angeles alley in July 1987, Nelson in a commercial dumpster behind a nightclub in August 1989, Apodaca inside an abandoned auto shop in September that same year. Medical examiners explained the injuries. Detectives traced how the old cases had come back to life through DNA. For the families of the dead, the courtroom became the only place where all of these pieces existed together. They had lived for decades with partial information and unanswered questions, and now their daughters' names were spoken alongside scientific evidence and the living suspect. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized the pattern: 3 women, all living with addiction, all strangled, and all left in public or semi-public spaces within a tight radius, and the same man's genetic material on their bodies. In the end, the jury rejected the alternate explanations. On September 25, 2014, Samuel Little was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, he reacted with anger, raising his voice and insisting that he had not committed the crimes. Reporters inside the courtroom described him shouting protests as marshals removed him. His outburst did not change the outcome. That same day, the judge imposed the maximum punishment available: 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The structure of the sentence ensured that at 74 years old, Little would die in custody. California's decision not to seek the death penalty reflected the age of the defendant, the cost and length of capital appeals, and the fact that perpetual imprisonment already guaranteed he would never leave state custody. He was transferred to California State Prison, Los Angeles County, which is a high-security facility in Lancaster, to begin serving those terms. Legally, the Los Angeles case closed 3 specific homicides. Practically, it opened the door for dozens of others. Once the conviction was secured, prosecutors and detectives in other jurisdictions had more leverage. They could approach Little as a man already sentenced to die behind bars, with nothing left to fear from additional convictions in terms of immediate freedom. Appeals in California did not go his way. When he lost a key appeal in 2018, he agreed to talk in exchange for being moved from county jail conditions to a state facility in Texas while awaiting trial on another case. That other case was the 1994 killing of the Denise Christie brothers in Odessa. An Ector County grand jury indicted him for brothers' murder in 2018. He was extradited from California to Texas to face trial. By then, his health had declined further. He appeared in Texas courts as an elderly man in a wheelchair, but the underlying charge was clear: another woman strangled and left in a vacant lot, her death unsolved for nearly a quarter of a century. In Odessa, the district attorney's office made a strategic choice. Texas law allowed for the death penalty, but prosecutors agreed to forego it if Little entered a guilty plea, gave a full account of brothers' killing, and continued to cooperate about other murders. It was a practical bargain. The state traded the symbolic weight of a capital sentence for the chance to close dozens of unopened case files and provide answers to families in multiple states. On December 13, 2018, Samuel Little stood before a Texas judge. This time, not to contest the facts, but to admit them. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in brother's death. The judge imposed a life sentence. This was his 4th. Little showed little emotion as the terms were read. For the brother's family, the hearing marked the end of a 24-year wait between the day her body was found and the moment the man responsible formally acknowledged what he had done. As word spread that he was now cooperating with investigators, attention shifted to Ohio. Prosecutors in Cuyahoga County had long unsolved strangulation cases from the 1980s and early 1990s that aligned with his travel history and methods. In June 2019, a grand jury in Hamilton County also handed down indictments for 2 murders linked to Cincinnati, the 1981 killing of Anna Stewart and a still unidentified woman. In Cleveland, the focus narrowed to 2 victims, 21-year-old Mary Jo Payton and 32-year-old Rose Evans. Their cases had remained open for decades. Payton disappeared after leaving a bar in 1984. Her body was found in an abandoned building. Evans' remains were discovered in a vacant lot in 1991. Both women had been strangled. In recorded interviews, Little carefully described meeting them, driving them to isolated locations, and killing them. On August 23, 2019, he appeared in a Cleveland courtroom by video link from his California prison. There was no jury, there was not a contested trial. Little entered guilty pleas to 2 counts of aggravated murder and 2 counts of kidnapping for Payton and Evans. The judge questioned him about whether he understood that he was giving up his right to a trial, to confront witnesses, and to challenge the state's evidence. Little answered calmly, acknowledging that he did understand. The sentence in Ohio reflected the gravity of the crimes, even though Little would never physically serve time there. The court imposed a term of 40 years to life in prison, to run after his existing life sentences. On paper, that meant he would not be eligible for parole until well past any plausible lifespan. For Payton and Evans' families, it also meant official acknowledgement in their home jurisdiction, a conviction, a sentence, and their loved ones named in open court as victims of Samuel Little. Other states pursued their own charges based on his confessions, though not all of them resulted in formal trials. In Kentucky, he was indicted for the 1981 murder of 23-year-old Linda Sue Boards. In Ohio, beyond the Cuyahoga County case, Hamilton County authorities continued to move forward on the Cincinnati murders. Alabama, Georgia, and other states weighed whether to file charges or leave their cases recorded as cleared by confession. The decisions often turned on resources and on whether a conviction would make any practical difference to a man already guaranteed to die in prison. Through all of this, Little's legal status remained anchored in California. He was, fundamentally, a California inmate serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was transported out of state only under guard and only when other jurisdiction needed him to stand before a judge. Each new plea or indictment added layers to his official record, but did not change his day-to-day reality. An aging prisoner housed in a medical unit, his world reduced to a wheelchair, a bed, and an occasional trip to an interview room. By the time he died in the Los Angeles County Hospital on December 30, 2020, at the age of 80, Little had collected 4 life sentences tied to 8 murder convictions in 3 states. Beyond those formal judgments, his own detailed admissions connected him to scores of additional killings. The courts could only process a fraction of the crimes he described, but the sentences they imposed were absolute. Legally and physically, they ensured that the man who had spent decades moving unchecked through American cities would not leave prison again. Samuel Little died on December 30, 2020, in a hospital outside California State Prison, Los Angeles County. He was 80 years old, serving multiple life sentences. He left custody only under guard and only for medical treatment, and it was during one of those hospital transfers that his heart finally failed. His body left the prison system the same way so many of his victims had left the world, on a gurney headed for an autopsy table. By the time of his death, Little was no longer just another aging inmate. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program had placed him in a separate category. Federal analysts had confirmed him as the most prolific serial killer in United States history by the number of victims. He had confessed to 93 murders. Analysts working with the Texas Rangers and local agencies had him linked to at least 50 killings by late 2019, and later tallies put the number of confirmed matches above 60. The official record listed only 8 murder convictions. His legacy rested on a much larger shadow. Those final years in custody did not resemble a quiet decline. They unfolded as a race between time and information. Little's health was deteriorating, and investigators knew it. Texas Ranger James Holland and FBI analysts from ViCAP sat across from him for hundreds of hours, prompting him for dates, cities, and details. A 60 Minutes profile later described roughly 700 hours of interviews, during which he unspooled his history, one victim at a time. The process that followed those interviews reshaped work in dozens of police departments. Each confession moved out from the Texas and federal teams to local agencies, where detectives matched his accounts against their own open files. The FBI published composite information and, eventually, an interactive map of his confessions. The Bureau released his hand-drawn portraits of unidentified women, each sketch labeled with a city and approximate year, and asked the public to study them. For agencies that had carried unsolved strangulation cases since the 1970s and 1980s, those drawings and timelines offered the first concrete lead in decades. Even after his death, the work did not stop. In 2021, the Texas Department of Public Safety and partnering agencies released new details on 31 unsolved killings believed to be part of his series, listing locations from Cincinnati to Las Vegas, Charleston, Gulfport, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, and 16 victims in Los Angeles alone. NBC and other outlets carried renewed appeals, highlighting that more than 60 of his confessions had been matched, but that many remained unsolved, with victims still unidentified. Los Angeles detectives described the work of chasing his remaining cases as chasing ghosts. Scenes erased by time, witnesses dead or scattered, physical evidence degraded or lost. For families, the aftermath unfolded along a narrower, more painful line. Some had lived for decades with no clear explanation for a mother, a sister, or a daughter's death. Others had never even had a suspect to attach to the anger and the grief. When Little began confessing, those households received phone calls from detectives they had not heard from in years. In Mississippi, the daughter of Julia Critchfield had grown up with a body in a dirt pit and no clear story about what had happened. She was 15 when her mother was found strangled, discarded at the bottom of a rural excavation near Saucier. As an adult, she described waking up every day, thinking of her mother and those last moments. When investigators linked Critchfield's 1978 murder to Little, that link did not erase the trauma, but it filled in a blank that had defined her life. Similar stories would surface in other states. In Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, and Ohio, relatives described the news of his confession as a painful form of relief. Fox News highlighted families who said they had always wondered about a missing sister or mother, and who now had a name and method to attach to their loss. One woman's sister called the confirmation "answers we never thought we would get," while acknowledging that it reopened wounds that had scabbed over but never truly healed. Closure in these cases did not mean a return to normal life. For many families, it meant re-examining old memories under a new light. A last phone call, a final argument, a decision to leave home for a night out that never ended. It meant attending new hearings or watching video of an elderly man calmly describing how he had strangled someone they loved. Some relatives went on camera or spoke to reporters in the hope that their stories might help identify other victims. Others kept their grief private, allowing only the barest details to seep into the public record. The institutions around those families had their own reckoning. Little's case exposed gaps that allowed him to operate for so long. The Washington Post and other outlets documented how he preyed on women at the margins of society, sex workers, drug users, women without stable housing, and how their deaths were often classified as overdoses, accidents, or undetermined causes, rather than homicides. Strangulation with hands can leave subtle or transient marks, especially when bodies are discovered late, and research on asphyxiation in sexually motivated killings underscores how often this method appears without obvious weapon injuries. When those victims already carry the stigma of drug use or street-level sex work, the likelihood that their deaths will be fully investigated drops even further. Academics writing on violence against sex workers have used Little's case to illustrate how social stigma and structural neglect create ideal conditions for serial offenders. Studies on serial killers who target sex workers describe a recurring pattern. Offenders interpret the public devaluation of these women as permission and often assume that no one will search for them with urgency. Little said he gravitated towards women he believed would not be missed. The pattern of misclassification in his victims' deaths, overdoses recorded where strangulation had taken place, natural causes listed where manual force had been used, shows how often that assumption proved correct in practice. Law enforcement agencies also confronted the limits of fragmented record keeping. For decades, his arrests for assault, attempted rape, and attacks on women remained scattered across different states. No one agency held the entire picture at once. The eventual linking of his crimes depended on ViCAP, which collects details on violent offences and searches for patterns across jurisdictions, and on the willingness of local police departments to send information and revisit old cases. After the scale of his offending became clear, some departments invested more heavily in cold case units and in protocols that flag repeating patterns in strangulations and attacks on sex workers. Others began to treat unexplained deaths of women on the streets with more suspicion, understanding that a ruling of undetermined can conceal a serial offender's work. At the same time, Little's confessions raised their own debates. The effort to tie dozens of unsolved homicides to a single imprisoned man carried echoes of earlier scandals, particularly the Henry Lee Lucas era in Texas, when officials cleared hundreds of cold cases based on unreliable confessions. The Washington Post highlighted the care taken by FBI and Texas analysts to avoid repeating that history, emphasizing that they required corroborating evidence before declaring a case linked. Even so, some legal scholars and journalists have urged caution, noting that once a confession is on record, it can be difficult to disentangle genuine memory from suggestion, especially in aging offenders confronted with detailed case information. The scrutiny around Texas Ranger James Holland's later work in another case fed that conversation. A Marshall Project investigation praised his skill in drawing out Little's history, but questioned whether the same interrogation style might have contributed to a dubious confession in a separate murder case. In Little's situation, the high rate of confirmed matches, the specificity of his memories, and the consistency of his method persuaded federal and state authorities that his accounts were largely accurate. Still, his story now appears in discussions about the balance between using confessions to close cold cases and ensuring that each case stands on more than one man's word. Beyond the legal system, Little's crimes prompted a wider examination of how society sorts victims. Commentators have noted that his name remains less widely known than other serial killers with fewer confirmed victims. Journalists and scholars have connected that relative obscurity to the fact that he was a black man whose victims were overwhelmingly women of color, sex workers, and women living with addiction or poverty. Public narratives about serial killers have often centered on white offenders and victims. Little's case forced a shift in that lens, bringing into view a landscape of violence that had long been underreported. For organizations working with sex workers and people in addiction, his story became a cautionary framework. Advocates pointed to the decades it took for law enforcement to recognize a pattern and use that delay as evidence that marginalized communities receive less urgent protection. Training materials for police now more frequently emphasize the risks faced by women in street economics, the importance of tracking non-fatal strangulation as a predictor of lethal violence, and the need to treat every unexplained death in those settings as a potential homicide until proven otherwise. Inside law enforcement circles, the Little investigation is often discussed as both a success and a warning. It shows the power of coordinated databases, patient interrogation, and renewed attention to cold cases. It also shows how long a determined offender can exploit blind spots when those tools are not fully used. Articles in Police One and other professional outlets frame the case as an example of the police working separately together, individual departments handling their own files but only solving the larger puzzle once they began true interagency collaboration. Culturally, Little's presence lingers in a quieter way than the more sensationalized serial killers of the past decades. There are books, documentaries, and dramatized interviews, but they often center less on him and more on the women he targeted and the investigators who tried late to bring their stories into the light. Writers and filmmakers are focused on the question of value, whose lives are treated as worthy of the full machinery of investigation, and whose deaths are accepted with minimal inquiry, and how that hierarchy can be changed. At the bureaucratic level, his legacy remains partly unfinished. Years after his death, the FBI, Texas DPS, and local agencies still maintain public pages dedicated to his unlinked victims, asking for help from anyone who recognizes a face from his drawings or details from his recollections. Each newly identified victim offers a narrow window of solace, a family that receives an answer, a death certificate that reflects what actually happened, a name restored where there had only been a Jane Doe. Each unidentified portrait stands as a reminder that many of the women he described still exist in a limbo between memory and record, their lives known only through the words of the man who ended them. Samuel Little's life ended in a prison hospital bed, but the structure he exposed remains. His confessions forced agencies to re-examine thousands of pages of cold case files and to confront how easy it had been to overlook certain victims. The numbers associated with his name, 93 confessed murders, more than 60 confirmed, and 8 formal convictions, tell one story. The quieter aftermath tells another, a slow, ongoing effort to give names back to the dead, to repair investigative systems that discounted them, and to trace city by city the full reach of violence that went largely unseen whilst he was still alive. I'm DM Green, and if you've listened this far, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Until the next time, this is In the Dark Mind.